So check it out. We have a landlord who owns a mansion in Brentwood, California. He decides to rent out the guest house on his property on Airbnb. A guest hits him up and says, hey, I'd like to stay there for 6 months. Would that be okay? And he says, sure, we can work that out. So they check in for their 6-month stay. After those 6 months pass, the guest doesn't check out and she stops paying rent. And here we are 17 months later, and the guest is still living in that guest house, still not paying rent, and she's saying the only way she'll move out is if the landlord pays her $100,000. This is one of the wildest landlord-tenant disputes that I have ever seen. Let's talk about how this whole thing unfolded. Okay, so this house is located at 125 North Tiger Tail Road. Thanks to the Real Deal for that information. You can see it's a pretty cool modern house. It looks like it was built within the past couple of years. Zillow says it's just a 2-bedroom, 4-bathroom house. It's about 3,000 square feet, and the guy who owns it bought it way back in 1995 for $750,000. So he definitely remodeled or rebuilt this place at some point since 1995. I think that's obvious. Check it out though. If we look at this thing just like on an aerial view, you can just see how close these quarters are. So right here is where the main house is, and then over here is where the guest quarters are. So you're separated by maybe like an 8-foot walkway at the most. And it looks like to get from the main house over to the garage, you actually have to walk through that corridor. So I'm sure every single time this guy leaves his house, he's just worried like, oh my gosh, what if that tenant's gonna be outside? Is this gonna be awkward? Speaking of that guy, or the owner of this house, he's got a pretty good following on Instagram. He says he's a dental expert, so I'm guessing that means that he is a dentist, but it looks like he does a bunch of public speaking and a bunch of traveling and a bunch of teeth repair. So he probably isn't like your regular everyday dentist. I think he does more like special custom work like veneers and stuff like that. Okay, now just looking at the timeline and exactly where this whole thing went wrong, we had this tenant, Elizabeth Hirschborn, who checked in to her Airbnb in September of 2021. Like I said at the start of the video, she checked in for a 6-month stay, and her rent rate at the time was only $105 per night, which amounts to what, like $3,000 per month. So to live in Brentwood, California at that rate, honestly, not bad. So this lease here was supposed to wrap up in April of 2022, but in March of 2022 is right about when things started to go sideways. This is when the tenant Elizabeth called the landlord and said, hey, my electronic blinds aren't working properly. Well, the landlord goes into the unit to fix the blinds, and while he's there, he notices that the sink's also not working right, and there looks to be some mold around the sink. And so he goes to the tenant and he says, hey, I'm gonna get the blinds fixed, but I also wanna fix this sink issue while I'm at it. Would you mind moving out into a hotel down the street for just 5 days? I'll pay for everything. I just want these contractors to be able to access your unit, fix all the problems, and then we can move on. Well, the tenant says no, she's not going to move out into a hotel because, for one, she feels like she's being forced to vacate. For two, she's got a disability. And for three, she's got a high risk of COVID complications, so she just doesn't want to go live in a hotel. Anyways, the landlord's like, okay, I guess you don't need to go stay in a hotel, but would you like to stay in my house for the 5 days while the contractors are doing the work? And she said, no, I'm not interested in doing that either. In fact, I think that's inappropriate. So remember, we're right up against when the lease was supposed to expire anyway. So at this point, the landlord realizes he's not going to be able to get inside her unit to fix the problems. And now he realizes that with her lease ending, she's still not willing to move out of the guest house because she's saying due to all these issues, she still has the right to stay. So he calls up the city housing department to try to get this tenant evicted. Well, that ended up backfiring because what the tenant did in response is they called the building department instead, and the building department came out to the guest house. They inspected the entire unit, and they deemed that this landlord never actually got a certificate of occupancy for the guest house, and he also remodeled the shower at one point, and he didn't get a permit for that. So the building department is saying, yes, I understand that you want to evict this lady, but this place isn't up to code, so you need to get this stuff fixed before you can evict her. From here, this is where things get even uglier because this tenant sent a complaint over to a housing investigator, which, by the way, I didn't even know that existed until this story. And basically, her complaint said that this landlord was illegally trying to evict raped her, he was harassing her, and he wouldn't pay for her relocation fees. And yeah, I guess after a little investigation, these housing people said that until the landlord got the guest house up to code, he would not be permitted to evict this tenant. This is how they ended up getting stuck in this like never-ending cycle, because we've got the landlord who's not allowed to evict the tenant until he can get into the unit and fix all the problems, but he can't get into the unit to make it compliant because the tenant won't let him into the unit. So the tenant has kind of figured out the perfect way to work the system and basically just squat in this mansion forever. Now at this point, it seems like there's basically no end in sight for either person in this case. We've got the landlord who's still trying to evict this lady, and on top of that, he's trying to get about $60,000 out of her to basically make up the rent that she should have been paying for the past 540 days. Then the tenant, on the other hand, has a ton of accusations against the landlord. I read that she's got like a dozen or maybe even more accusations against him or open cases against him, but ultimately her goal is, okay, I'll move out of this place, but you need to pay me a $100,000 relocation fee. I wanted to show you guys something. So I posted this whole story on Bigger Pockets the other day. If you guys don't know what Bigger Pockets is, this website is awesome. It's actually where I learned everything that I know about real estate investing anyway, at least in the very beginning. They've got forums and blogs and podcasts and the whole nine yards, but I posted this story in the forums just to kind of see what everyone had to say, and some of the responses are pretty good, so let's check them out. So JD Martin says that he would burn down his own house before he would allow this to go on. Sarah calls out that this should have been structured as a long-term rental lease, which I agree. Typically, if you're going to rent something out to somebody for 6 months, you're not going to do that on Airbnb. You're going to use an actual lease. This is probably going to give you some more rights to evict someone if something like this happens. Rodney here had a comment that a lot of people agreed with. Basically, he said that the landlord is absolutely in the wrong for renting a property that's not permitted, but this also does not warrant providing free housing for someone and have them basically take hostage of the unit, demanding what's effectively a ransom. And there he's referring to that $100,000 fee that she's demanding. Jay said if this was him, he would do what Tony Soprano did, get a huge speaker and blare it 24/7 right into the unit. Teresa makes a good point. She says if the place was unpermitted, then why would they rule for the tenant? Why not just say that the guest house needs to be removed? She'd be tempted to cut off the power and water, saying it's not permitted, therefore she's worried that something might happen. And then Chad hops in and he offers kind of a voice of reason that this is one of those topics that, yeah, the tenant is kind of a predator party in this situation technically, but it needs to be handled very delicately. He calls out that obviously if you're blasting noise and doing stuff like that, that's going to cause more problems for the tenant and it's not going to look good in front of a judge. And ultimately, at the end of the day, if the landlord wants to try to get out of this situation in a somewhat smooth manner, he's going to need a really aggressive attorney. One more thing I'm going to mention too, though, before we close this out is I'm actually affiliated with Bigger Pockets now, which is kind of a new thing, and it's pretty exciting for me because I'm a huge fan of this website. Like I said, I basically learned everything that I needed to know in the beginning of my real estate investing journey on Bigger Pockets. If you guys want to become a member of Bigger Pockets, use the link down in my description and the special discount code that's listed there, and you'll get a discount on your membership fees, which is pretty cool. Or even if you just want to sign up for a free membership, you're bound to see me there almost every day. I usually start my days for the first 15 minutes or so with a coffee, just hopping on the forums and posting some comments. It's a wild story, you guys, and I'm trying to stay kind of even keeled with this one because I don't want anyone to get too mad at me in the comments, but I do feel like it's probably time for both the landlord and the tenant to just move on and go their separate ways. That's just my 2 cents though. Let me know what you guys think in the comments. I'll see you next time.